Hi, I want to talk to you today about Anselm's view of freedom of the will. It's something he develops over the course of 3 works, on the freedom of the will, De Concordia, and also on the fall of the devil. It's something that I think is contributing a unique perspective to the analysis of freedom of the will, and he is one of the first people to really directly advocate a voluntarist position. That is to say, he says determinism and freedom of the will are absolute contradictories, and he denies determinism. He argues that we really do have freedom. He has a unique conception of exactly what that involves, but it's something that I think is worth taking seriously. It has a deep impact on Descartes, on Kant, and on the existentialists much later. So let's turn to Anselm's view and try to understand what he has in mind. He starts by noting that it looks as if freedom of the will contradicts God's predestination, contradicts the notion of grace as something that is salvific, that saves us no matter what we do. And he thinks that there is a deep theological question here about the nature of our relationship with God. So this is no trivial question, nor is it purely a philosophical exercise. It's something he thinks that has to do with the way we live life in general, and in particular in the way that people should go about living a Christian life. The dispute that Anselm has in mind, and that he's trying to make a contribution to, is a dispute that goes all the way back to Augustine and Pelagius, a monk who opposed him. The idea was roughly this: how do we earn salvation? How do we earn God's approval and God's grace? Well, according to Pelagius, and it's a view that is common, really, among a lot of people, whether they're religious or not, is that we have to earn that. Basically, you live a good life. You do the right thing. And how do you do that? Well, you behave according to God's law. You do a variety of things that are ethically the proper things to do. And of course, no one denies that it's good to be good. It's good to do the right thing. However, Pelagius said, well, that's how you, in effect, earn your way into heaven. In the end, it's up to you. Now, it's not quite that simple. He thinks that we have the ability to follow God, that we can actually become good, that the fall of mankind is not an insurmountable obstacle, doesn't really change our nature. We do have the capacity to actually follow the law of God. Augustine thought this was unacceptable, and indeed later he triumphed in this dispute, and this has been declared a heresy. But what is his position? Well, that God predestines us. It is God's grace and God's grace alone that saves us. And that seems independent of what we do. That's something that may actually cause us to have faith. It may cause us to do the right thing. But our own faith and our own actions do not themselves cause God's approval. It's rather the gift of God's grace that might have the effect on us of leading us to faith and leading us to live a good Christian life. Well, this is no trivial matter. It has some important implications, and actually both positions have problems. They face puzzles. If Pelagius is right, if it's a question of our ability to lead a good ethical life ourselves, and so earn God's grace, well then what is the point of grace? Is there anything that's actually a gift from God? It's more like God sets up a test and we have to pass the test. Moreover, it's puzzling from that point of view what the whole point of the incarnation of Christ's death and resurrection really is. I guess it comes down to this. Well, Jesus set an ethical example for us. But it's not clear that the resurrection, that the death on the cross, have anything in particular to do with that. Why didn't Jesus just come and start writing and teaching about ethics, if that was the whole point? And so it looks as if it's hard to explain, really, the role of Jesus of Nazareth, and why the entire Christian story, you might say, that culminates in the death and the resurrection of Christ, why any of that really is essential to the picture. Augustine's position, though, presents puzzles of its own. If it's true that grace is simply a gift from God, that some are saved and predestined to salvation, while others are not, it's not clear that the way we live has any relevance at all. Why bother to try to become virtuous, to try to follow God's law, to try to become a better person? It looks like all of that is irrelevant. Either you've got the gift or not. If you've got the gift, well, hey, you're in no matter what happens. And so it looks as if it's hard to motivate people to really try to develop faith, to try to develop their own virtue, to try to live a good ethical life. So both views have puzzles, and Anselm thinks he's found a way in between, a way of capturing both the significance of the incarnation, death, and resurrection of Christ, but also the role of our own freedom, our freedom of the will, and the role that that plays. We are not simply recipients of God's gift. We do receive God's gift, but we have to do something. And so there is an attempt here to save freedom of the will at the same time that we also can account for the significance of the Christian faith. Anselm begins by analyzing the concept of freedom. He thinks it's commonly misunderstood. In ordinary language, and in Augustine, freedom is understood as the ability to have choices, the ability to do this or do that thing. In particular, in an ethical context, the ability to sin or not to sin. But we might generalize beyond that to say you're free to the extent that you can choose among a range of possibilities. You've got a variety of things that face you as options, and you are freer the more options you have available to choose. You're less free when you get down to fewer options, and ultimately you lose your freedom altogether if there's only one, if it's necessary that you do it. So in short, it looks as if from the traditional point of view, as well as Augustine's point of view, we could define freedom as the ability to choose among various possibilities. Whatever you do, you could be said to act freely if you could have done otherwise, if there were other options available to you. And in general, the range of choice, being more free or less free, is a matter of the width of that range, how many options you have. That definition is commonsensical, but it has some disturbing implications. One of them is about God. It seems to imply that God cannot act freely. Now why? Well, God is good, and God is necessarily good. So could God do evil? No, that's not even a possibility for God. But we don't want to conclude that because God could not have done otherwise, therefore God does not act freely in doing good. So that's the first disturbing implication. The second arises when we think about Paul and John in various passages talking about being a slave to sin. John says that he who sins is a slave to sin. Paul says, it is not I who sin, but the sin that dwells within me. Both are sensing sin as something like an alien power, not one that expands my freedom to sin or not to sin, but instead one that limits my freedom, that turns me into a slave to sin. Of course, it really is, in the sense, I who sin, and so I am responsible for this, but I am responsible, in this sense, for enslaving myself to sin. I am something like a voluntary slave to sin when I am sinning, and becoming virtuous, receiving the grace of God, and attaining the ability to overcome that through God's help. That's something that frees me. It is something that allows me, in the words of Paul, to cast off the yoke of bondage. Now, later political philosophers, people like John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, John Stuart Mill, talk about voluntary slavery. And at first glance that can be puzzling. Very few people in the history of the world have sold themselves into slavery, though some have. But they see it as an analog to basically agreeing to a social contract that would give someone else absolute power over you, a monarch, for example. That's a political version of what Anselm sees as something like a much more personal ethical question. When I sin, I enslave myself to sin. And the fall of man consists in something like our voluntary enslavement to sin. So are we sinning freely? Well, in one sense, yes. In another sense, no. We are now slaves to sin and not acting freely in one way. But on the other hand, in another sense, which he makes clear, I am doing this freely. I am somebody who is responsible for my own state. I have voluntarily adopted this, and I retain a freedom, even though I'm now enslaved. So I can be both slave and free because I have become a slave voluntarily. And I retain that power, even though, in some sense, as a slave to sin, I've also lost my ability to exercise it. The key to understanding Anselm's concept of freedom is to ask what the will itself and our freedom of the will is for. It's not just a question of choosing, as if it's fine to have as many options as possible. In fact, it's good to have as many options as possible, and the will is just for choosing among them, as it were, arbitrarily or even rationally. The will is a tool for enabling us to choose the right thing. And indeed, God wants us to do the right thing, but also wants us to choose the right thing. It's not enough that we do it as a robot or as a slave. We are to do it for its own sake, because we choose it, and we choose it because it is the right thing to do. So here is the general picture. Define justice as a matter of the rightness of the will, but the rightness of a will that is pursuing rightness for its own sake. In other words, let's call ourselves just when we do the right thing for the right reason, namely, because it's the right thing to do. Then we can say that freedom of the will is a matter of having the power to maintain or to keep that justice. As he puts it, it's a matter of having the capacity to preserve the rectitude of the will for the sake of that rectitude itself. Now that formulation can seem initially surprising, but it's a matter of having the ability to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, and to preserve that ability in us. That is what true freedom of the will is, and that's what we lose when we enslave ourselves to sin. At least we lose our ability to exercise it. In some sense, we still have that faculty, as we'll see, but we lose our ability to use it and to actually choose the right thing for the right reason. That's what grace restores in us. Now initially, Anselm's student, with whom he's in dialogue on the freedom of the will, is puzzled by this whole matter. He says, look, the sinner either sins by necessity or sins voluntarily. And in both cases, he says, we've got trouble. If the sinner sins by necessity, then it looks like, look, they didn't have any choice. You really can't blame somebody for something that they had no choice about. You can't really hold them responsible. So you can't hold people responsible for sin if they're acting by necessity. Are they really choosing sin freely? Well, if they are, then it looks like Pelagius was right after all. It's up to us to act well or act not, to use our freedom or not. And so in the end, you might say, yes, we just have to earn our way to salvation by leading a good ethical life. Anselm says not so fast. What we have to say here is that there is a sense in which they sin freely and another sense in which they don't. They do still have that power, but they don't exercise it. And in fact, they've placed themselves in a position where they cannot exercise it. They sinned through their own free will, but not through that makes it free. Now, at first glance, you might say, that's surprising. And it's the kind of distinction that makes scholastic philosophy sometimes have a bad reputation. It sounds complicated and maybe needlessly complicated. But Anselm's point, I think, is an important one. It's not a needless complication. Yes, they sin out of an exercise of freedom in a way. However, not for the purpose that freedom is given to them. They're making the wrong choice, basically. And so are they making the wrong choice freely? Well, in one sense, yes. In another sense, no. Yes, they are choosing it. But on the other hand, the point of that faculty of choice is to enable them to do the right thing. So, yes, they're using that faculty, but they're misusing that faculty. They're not using it for the purpose for which it's intended. And that leads us to say that in some sense the action is free, but not in the richest sense. Now, Anselm, whenever he's talking about this, says, okay, so the sinner does these things of their own accord. And he uses a term for that, sponte, in the Latin, that indicates, yes, they're doing it of their own accord. They are in some sense choosing it. On the other hand, they're not really doing it freely. There he uses the term libere. They are not really doing it freely, though they are doing it of their own accord. There's a difference. They are misusing the faculty of choice. And so are they choosing? Well, yes, but they're misusing it. If I am trying to use a knife to cut something, and I'm using the wrong side of the knife so that it's actually not very sharp, but it's not doing a good job of cutting, well then, am I using the knife to cut it? Yeah, in a sense I am, but I'm not using it the way it's intended. I'm misusing the knife. And that's something like what the sinner is doing with freedom of the will. Yes, in some sense they are employing freedom of the will to choose, but they're doing it poorly. They're misusing it. We can go back to the point about voluntary slavery. The sinner is someone who is, in a sense, misusing freedom by agreeing to give up their freedom to sin. Just as a voluntary slave might be making the free choice to become a slave and give up their freedom. There is something odd in that idea of being free not to be free. But that's exactly what's going on here. Someone is exercising the freedom not to be free. And that is sort of paradoxical, but it's possible. Think of the addict who chooses the addiction, chooses to become an addict. Are they free or not? Are they taking the drug freely? Well, in a sense, they've chosen that life of addiction. But now that they're addicted, they don't really have much choice about it. And so we could say that, in a sense, they're taking the drug of their own accord, but on the other hand, not truly freely, because they have freely chosen to enslave themselves.